The night air over Stillwater, Oklahoma, carried the kind of calm that fools you into thinking nothing bad could ever happen there. It was May 4th, 2001, the eve of graduation season, when laughter from nearby college bars floated across quiet streets and the future felt close enough to touch. But on that warm Friday night, one young woman's walk home would carve a wound into this town that would never close. Her name was Taryn Whitlow, 22 years old, full of plans, and counting down the days until she could start her new life in Dallas. She had spent that evening celebrating with her best friend, Brooklyn Hayes, at a local hangout known to everyone in Stillwater, the Crimson Ale House. The music was loud, the drinks were cheap, and for a few fleeting hours, life was easy. But as the clock neared midnight, Taryn decided to call it a night. Her friends offered her a ride, but she smiled, waved them off, and said, "I need the walk. It's just 6 blocks." 6 blocks. That's all it was supposed to be. The lights of the alehouse glowed behind her as she stepped onto Elm Street, a route she had taken dozens of times. The streetlights hummed quietly. The wind was still. Every sound, every movement was swallowed by that silence. Somewhere between the laughter fading in the distance and the key ring in her hand, Taryn vanished. By the time the sun rose, her absence wasn't just noticed, it was felt, like a crack spreading through the entire community. Before we dive in, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. If you enjoy true crime stories like this, be sure to like the video, subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and share it with someone who'd love it too. Before we continue, if you're a fan of true crime and cold case investigations, you won't want to miss our new book, 50 Cold Cases Solved. 50 real stories of the world's most notorious cases where time almost erased the truth until one clue changed everything. Now available for instant digital download. You'll find the link in the video description and in a pinned comment. Now, let's dive into today's case. When Brooklyn woke up that Saturday morning, the sunlight felt wrong. The same sunlight that should have meant another lazy weekend brunch between friends now pressed down like a weight. Taryn wasn't answering her phone, not the first call, not the second. Brooklyn tried to convince herself it was nothing. Maybe Taryn had gone for an early walk. Maybe she'd overslept. But by the third unanswered ring, a quiet panic began to build behind her ribs. By noon, that panic had a voice. Brooklyn drove to Taryn's little yellow cottage, the Sunshine Shack, as everyone called it. Her car sat neatly in the driveway. Mail still stuffed the box. A half-drunk glass of water waited on the counter, sweating from the morning heat. Everything was frozen in time except for her. Brooklyn called her name until her throat hurt. Nothing. The door was locked, the blinds half drawn. When their elderly neighbor, Pierce Holden, helped her open it with a spare key, what they found inside wasn't chaos. It was worse. The laptop sat open on the desk. The wallet and ID lay untouched. Her favorite sweater was draped across the couch. The only thing missing was her keys, the same keys she'd been holding when she waved goodbye the night before. That's when Brooklyn's hands began to shake. She stood in that small living room and realized what no friend ever wants to accept: something was horribly wrong. This wasn't someone who decided to run away. This was someone who was taken. Outside, the town was still going about its day, families mowing lawns, students running errands, nobody realizing a storm had already hit. By sunset, the word would spread, and Stillwater would start whispering. By the time the police arrived, those whispers had turned into fear. By the time the sun began to fall, the quiet charm of Stillwater was gone. Sirens broke the evening calm, slicing through streets that had never known real fear. Patrol cars lined Elm Street, their red and blue lights pulsing against the walls of student houses. Neighbors gathered on porches, whispering, hoping it was all a misunderstanding. But inside the Sunshine Shack, the look on Detective Lyle Kincaid's face said otherwise. Kincaid wasn't easily shaken, but that night something in his gut turned. Taryn's shoes were by the door, her planner open on the kitchen counter, her notes full of plans for the week ahead. Nothing about the scene said, "Run away." Everything about it screamed interruption. He stepped back outside to the yard where Brooklyn stood, her eyes swollen from crying. "She wouldn't just leave," she said, her voice cracking. "She wouldn't." Kincaid didn't answer right away. He'd seen denial before, parents clinging to hope, friends convincing themselves it was all a mistake. But this felt different. There was no trace, no clue, no reason. By midnight, the search had begun. Flashlights swept through fields, alleys, and empty parking lots. Students volunteered, calling her name into the dark. Every unanswered echo twisted deeper into their chests. Stillwater was a small town, but that night it felt endless, every shadow a question, every sound a threat. Brooklyn refused to go home. Valerie Whitlow, Taryn's mother, was on the road within hours, speeding through the night, unaware her life was about to break in two. When dawn came, there were no answers. Just tired faces, cold coffee, and one chilling realization: Taryn Whitlow had vanished into thin air. The hope that carried through the night was fading fast, replaced by something heavier, something close to rage. By sunrise, the story had already spread across Stillwater. Flyers with Taryn's smiling face were taped to light poles, convenience stores, and coffee shop doors. The town that had laughed its way through Friday night was now holding its breath. At 7:12 a.m., a car pulled up outside the Sunshine Shack. Valerie Whitlow stepped out, still in the clothes she'd thrown on after Brooklyn's frantic call. She didn't speak when she saw the patrol cars. She didn't have to. Every mother knows the sound of silence that follows a question no one wants to answer. When Detective Kincaid introduced himself, Valerie's eyes locked on his, demanding the truth he didn't yet have. "She was supposed to call me last night," she whispered. "She never misses a call." Her voice cracked, anger fighting its way through grief. How does someone just vanish in a town this small? That question hung in the air like a verdict. The officers had no answer, only clipboards and theories that led nowhere. By mid-morning, reporters began circling, and the neighborhood filled with people offering help, prayers, and empty reassurances. Stillwater's sense of safety was gone. Every parent clutched their children tighter. Every young woman looked over her shoulder. If this happened in your town, would you still walk home alone? Subscribe so you don't miss what really happened next. Detective Kincaid called for search dogs, drones, and volunteers. Valerie refused to rest. Every time someone said, "We'll find her," she'd snap, "Don't tell me that, show me." She didn't think it could happen 6 blocks from home. Most people never do. Don't be one of them. Subscribe before the next story finds you unprepared. By afternoon, the flyers were everywhere, but Taryn wasn't, and the longer the silence stretched, the louder it screamed. The late morning sun bounced off the yellow paint of Taryn's cottage, a color she'd chosen because it made her feel calm, alive, and safe. But that Saturday, the Sunshine Shack didn't feel like home. It felt hollow. Brooklyn parked her car in the gravel driveway, her heart racing as she stared at Taryn's silver Pontiac sitting perfectly where she left it the night before. Nothing about the scene looked wrong, and that was the problem. The world looked unchanged while hers was collapsing. She called out her best friend's name through the front door, but the silence pressed back harder with every try. Taryn wasn't the type to disappear. She was organized, punctual, the one who reminded others of their appointments. Every detail of her life was mapped out, every detail except this one. Brooklyn tried the handle. Locked. She pounded on the wood until her hands hurt, shouting until her throat tightened. A passing jogger slowed, sensing something wasn't right. Moments later, a neighbor, Pierce Holden, an elderly man with kind eyes, walked over, holding the spare key he'd kept for emergencies. His hands trembled as he unlocked the door, as if he already knew what they wouldn't find. The air inside felt stale, untouched. The faint smell of coffee lingered from the night before. A sweater lay on the couch. A small lamp glowed weakly in the corner, still plugged in. Brooklyn's voice cracked when she whispered, "Taryn?" No answer, no movement, just a quiet that felt cruel. She stepped deeper into the house, knowing what she would never say aloud. Taryn was gone, and this house wasn't hers anymore. It belonged to the question that had just been born. Where did she go? The key turned in the lock with a faint click, and the door eased open. A gentle wave of air greeted them, the kind that comes from a place recently lived in, now waiting for someone who would never return. Brooklyn stepped inside first, her shoes brushing against the woven rug Taryn bought from a thrift store downtown. It was slightly crooked, just like always. On the desk by the window sat Taryn's laptop, screen dark but warm to the touch, the cursor still blinking from an unfinished email. She had been there recently. A mug sat beside it, half full, a film of coffee cooling on top. The sight hit Brooklyn harder than anything else. The ordinary things hurt the most. The folded laundry on the chair, the shoes lined perfectly by the mat, the open sketchbook with a design half drawn in bright ink. This wasn't a scene of chaos. It was a snapshot of a life interrupted. Pierce stood silently in the doorway, hat in hand, watching Brooklyn pace through the room like she was afraid to breathe too loudly. "Everything looks normal," he said quietly. Brooklyn shook her head. "No, it doesn't. She never leaves her phone behind." Her eyes darted across the counter. There it was, plugged in, screen glowing with a missed call. One call. From Brooklyn herself. Her chest tightened. The air in the room felt heavier now, as though the house itself was holding its breath. She wanted to believe Taryn had stepped out and would walk back in any moment, smiling, explaining everything away. But every minute stretched longer, louder. Each second screamed the truth she was trying not to face. Something was missing, and it wasn't just her friend. Brooklyn stood in the center of the room, gripping her phone, listening to the empty ringing that followed every attempt to call Taryn again. Each ring cut deeper, echoing through the stillness until it became unbearable. She turned in slow circles, searching for anything that didn't fit. The bed was made. Her purse sat on the nightstand. The light switch clicked under her fingers, still working, still normal. Everything was normal except for the fact that Taryn wasn't there. Panic hit like a wave. She ran outside, calling her name into the street. No answer. A neighbor watering his lawn looked up, confused. Another student walking past slowed down, noticing the fear in her voice. Brooklyn's tone said, what words couldn't. This wasn't a misunderstanding. Within minutes, she was on the phone with 911. Her words tumbling out so fast that the operator had to ask her to repeat them. "She's missing," Brooklyn said. "Her car's here, her phone's here, but she's gone." When the first patrol car arrived, she felt both relief and dread. The officers moved quietly, taking notes, asking questions, checking the yard, the doors, the windows. One of them walked the short path to the mailbox, glancing around as though expecting Taryn to appear at any second. But she didn't. The officers exchanged looks, subtle, careful, but unmistakably grim. Brooklyn's hands wouldn't stop shaking. Her voice cracked when she whispered, "This isn't real. She was fine last night." That was when Stillwater's quiet began to crumble. A missing woman in a college town meant danger that no one could explain. For Brooklyn, it wasn't just fear, it was guilt. She'd offered her a ride. She hadn't insisted. 2 more patrol cars arrived before noon, their tires crunching over the gravel. The air around the Sunshine Shack had changed. It was heavier now, the kind that sits in your chest and won't let go. The neighbors had stopped pretending it was a misunderstanding. They stood quietly on their porches, watching, whispering, hoping for any sign that this wasn't what it looked like. Detective Lyle Kincaid stepped out of his car and took one slow look at the house. His eyes moved over the yard, the untouched car, the locked door, and finally to Brooklyn, who looked like she hadn't blinked in an hour. He didn't need to hear the full story. One glance told him this wasn't a girl who decided to run away. He spoke gently, asking questions, moving through the house like a man listening for ghosts. He noticed the keys missing from the bowl by the door, a detail most would have overlooked. To him, it meant Taryn had walked out willingly, not dragged. But where to? And why hadn't she made it the rest of the way home? Outside, Valerie had arrived, her face pale and fierce all at once. She stood still as Kincaid explained what little they knew, her jaw tightening with every word. There were no signs of a struggle, no message, no trace. When he told her they'd begin a formal search, she didn't cry. She just said, "You'll find her," like it was both an order and a prayer. Brooklyn leaned against the porch railing, staring at the empty road, her voice breaking. "I should have made her let me drive her home." Have you ever had that gut feeling something was wrong before anyone else did? The first night of the search was about to begin, and Stillwater was about to lose its sleep. By Saturday evening, Stillwater wasn't the same town it had been 24 hours ago. What began as whispers outside the Sunshine Shack had turned into the one word no community wants to hear missing. Within hours, flyers printed on pale orange paper were everywhere. The photo, Taryn's bright auburn hair, her wide grin, was impossible to ignore. Students handed them out at gas stations, grocery stores, even at campus parties. No one wanted to believe what the paper said, but they couldn't look away either. Detective Lyle Kincaid stood in the center of the command post set up near campus, watching as volunteers signed in. Maps covered the walls. Red markers circled key areas: Elm Street, the alley behind the Crimson Ale House, and the small patch of woods near the riverbank. He'd seen missing person searches before, but this one felt different. It wasn't just the case of another young woman gone missing, it was the stillness of it all. No argument, no struggle, no witnesses. She'd simply stopped existing somewhere between point A and point B. Valerie Whitlow refused to sit down. She moved between search groups, handing out water, asking if anyone had seen anything at all. Her voice carried down the street. She was wearing a red jacket. Walking east, someone saw her. But nobody had. Not one person could say where that bright red jacket went after she left the light of the bar. By nightfall, the fields and back streets were crawling with flashlights and the low hum of radio chatter. Still, nothing. For the first time, Kincaid felt it in his gut. The case wasn't starting. It was already slipping away. As darkness fell over Stillwater, the town came alive in ways it never had before. Headlights cut through the fields. Volunteers walked shoulder to shoulder, combing through ditches, alleyways, and parking lots. Every few minutes, a voice would call out Taryn's name, and then another, until it sounded like the entire town was pleading with the night to answer. The local fire department brought in searchlights that painted the streets in harsh white beams. The hum of generators filled the air. Families who didn't even know Taryn left their porch lights on, as if the glow might somehow guide her home. Inside the command tent, Detective Kincaid studied the growing map of searched zones. He moved pins, scribbled notes, and listened to updates from exhausted officers. Each report came back the same: nothing found. Not a shoe, not a strand of hair, not even the faintest clue. Brooklyn refused to leave. Her hands shook as she handed out bottles of water to volunteers. Valerie stood near the edge of the tent, arms crossed tightly around herself, whispering the same sentence over and over. She's close. She has to be close. By 3 a.m., even the strongest voices were fading. Some searchers sat on curbs with their heads in their hands. Others stared at the ground, refusing to give up but too afraid to say what they were thinking. Kincaid stepped outside, feeling the chill cut through his jacket. The silence between the calls of her name had grown longer, heavier, the kind of silence that only comes when people start to lose faith. Stillwater wasn't sleeping, it was waiting, and the waiting was starting to hurt. When the first light of Sunday morning broke across Stillwater, it didn't bring comfort, it brought faces streaked with fatigue and eyes that had forgotten how to blink. The search teams had been out all night, walking through fields wet with dew, checking every shadow twice, hoping for anything that made sense. Nothing did. The parking lot near the Crimson Ale House was littered with coffee cups, maps, and half-empty flashlights. Kincaid stood by the hood of his car, watching another team return empty-handed. His jaw was tight. He hated this part, the moment when energy fades and questions multiply. Valerie refused to rest. "You're not stopping, right?" she asked Kincaid, her voice trembling but sharp. "Not for a second." He shook his head, though he hadn't slept in 20 hours. "We keep going," he said, but his tone lacked conviction. Across town, reporters had started to gather near the police barricades, cameras ready. They wanted statements. The community wanted miracles. Kincaid could give neither. Brooklyn sat on the back of a patrol car, face buried in her hands. When a young officer offered her a blanket, she whispered, "She's out there somewhere. We just don't know where." The morning sun burned bright against the empty streets, but it didn't feel like morning, it felt like a countdown. The hope that had carried them through the night was fraying, thread by thread. Kincaid walked the perimeter one last time before regrouping his team. The air smelled like dry grass and disappointment. He looked down the stretch of road Taryn was last seen walking. 6 blocks. Just 6. He turned back toward the house and muttered, almost to himself, "We're missing something. We have to be." By Monday morning, the noise had stopped. The radios that once buzzed with constant updates were silent. The helicopters circling overhead, had returned to their hangars. Stillwater had gone still not because anyone had found Taryn, but because no one knew where else to look. Detective Kincaid stood outside the Sunshine Shack with a file under his arm, watching volunteers slowly drift away. The street looked unchanged, lawns trimmed, mailboxes full, morning sprinklers hissing, but to him, everything felt wrong. The world had moved forward, and she was still gone. Valerie sat on the porch steps, eyes fixed on the sidewalk her daughter should have walked up. She wasn't crying anymore. That scared Kincaid more than the tears ever had. "You're giving up," she said quietly, not looking at him. "No," he answered, but even he didn't believe it. Brooklyn arrived carrying a box of flyers that no one wanted to hang anymore. "People are saying it's been too long," she murmured, voice flat. "Too long for her to still be alive." Valerie turned sharply. "Don't say that." Brooklyn's eyes filled with tears. "I have to think it. Someone has to say it." Kincaid watched them both, his chest heavy. He'd gone over every inch of her route, checked every security camera, interviewed every neighbor. Nothing. Not one lead. He looked down that quiet stretch of road where streetlights buzzed faintly in the daylight and said the only thing that fit. "It's like she walked off the face of the earth." The silence that followed swallowed everything. If this were your loved one, how long before you'd lose hope? By the second week, the search for Taryn Whitlow had become more than an investigation, it had become conversation. Stillwater was a town where everyone knew everyone, and that made silence impossible. In coffee shops, grocery aisles, and classroom hallways, the same question passed from mouth to mouth like wildfire. Who took her? Detective Kincaid knew this stage well. When facts ran dry, people filled the gaps with stories. Rumors multiplied faster than lead stories about a car parked too long on Elm Street, about strangers seen near the campus, about a supposed argument Taryn had the week before. Most of it was noise. But buried in that noise was one name that kept returning: Trevor Scott. Trevor had dated Taryn briefly the previous semester, a relationship that ended cleanly, or so it seemed. Now, whispers painted him as possessive, unstable, maybe even jealous of her plans after graduation. Brooklyn swore the breakup had been mutual, but the town had already made up its mind. Kincaid sighed as he looked over Trevor's name on the suspect list. He didn't believe in coincidences, but he didn't believe in mob conclusions either. Still, in cases like this, the people closest to the victim were always the first to face the spotlight. By the time Kincaid's team reached Trevor's apartment, news vans were already parked outside. Cameras rolled, neighbors stared, and the young man's face was splashed across every local broadcast before he could even speak a word. Trevor looked stunned, not defensive, just hollow. He said, "I didn't hurt her." But in a town desperate for answers, innocence wasn't enough. The interrogation room smelled of stale coffee and tension. Trevor Scott sat across from Detective Kincaid, his hands folded, knuckles pale from the pressure. He'd been questioned for hours, the same questions, just rearranged. "Where were you that night? Who can verify it? Why did you call her last week?" Trevor's voice cracked the fourth time he answered, "I told you, I was at the fraternity house. Ask anyone who was there." His tone wasn't defiant, it was pleading. He was only 23, barely old enough to understand how fast a life can turn upside down. Kincaid studied him quietly. The boy's eyes were bloodshot, his breathing shallow. He wasn't reading a liar, he was reading someone trapped between fear and frustration. The detective leaned forward. "If you care about her, help me find her. Tell me something I can use." Trevor shook his head slowly. "I wish I could. I haven't seen her since March." He rubbed his face, the weight of accusation sinking deeper. "You think I could hurt her? I couldn't even look at her when she ended things." Outside the room, Valerie sat with her arms crossed, avoiding the camera flashes through the station's window. Every motherly instinct told her to hate him, but another part, the tired, logical part, whispered that this wasn't it. When Trevor's alibi checked out, Kincaid felt no relief, only irritation. They had spent days chasing a shadow that led nowhere. Back at the command post, he stared at the map again, red markers fading under fingerprints and exhaustion. For every rumor disproved, two more replaced it. Stillwater wasn't helping anymore. It was turning on itself. By the third week, Stillwater didn't need facts, it had a villain. Trevor couldn't step outside without whispers following him. Neighbors who once waved now crossed the street. His job at the local hardware store vanished overnight after customers started asking if he was that guy. The media made it worse. Headlines like, "Former boyfriend questioned in Stillwater mystery," filled the evening broadcasts. His photo-tired eyes, disheveled hair became the symbol of what people wanted to believe, that monsters looked like this. Detective Kincaid sat in his office, flipping through Trevor's file again. Every record, every timestamp, every phone ping aligned with the alibi. The kid was clean. "We're wasting time," he muttered, tossing the report onto the desk. But his voice lacked victory. He called Valerie that afternoon to update her. "There's no evidence linking him," he said gently. Her pause on the other end was long. "Then find who did. Don't tell me who didn't." Kincaid felt that sentence settle like a stone in his chest. Meanwhile, Brooklyn avoided social media entirely. She couldn't stand the comments strangers turning Taryn's tragedy into entertainment. "They don't even know her," she said to a reporter who wouldn't stop asking about Trevor. "They just need someone to blame." By sunset, another false rumor had already started that Taryn had been seen in Wichita. Kincaid's phone buzzed nonstop, each new message pulling the case further off course. He knew how this went. Rumor was fast, truth was slow, and right now, Stillwater only had time for one of them. It was a truck driver who called it in, a man from Guthrie, claiming he'd seen a woman who looked exactly like Taryn getting into a faded blue sedan at a rest stop off Highway 33. He said she looked nervous, maybe scared. For Valerie, that was enough. Hope didn't need proof. It only needed possibility. Within hours, Kincaid and 2 officers were on the road, chasing the lead that everyone prayed would break the case open. Valerie followed in her own car, gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. "If it's her," she whispered to herself, "if she's alive, I'll never let her out of my sight again." The rest stop was quiet when they arrived. A line of trucks idled in the distance, their engines humming in the cold air. The gas station attendant shrugged when shown Taryn's photo. "A lot of girls come through here," he said. "Could have been anyone." Kincaid checked every camera angle, every witness, every receipt from that night. Nothing matched. The sedan was never identified, and the woman in question turned out to be a traveler heading to Kansas. Wrong girl, wrong story, another blow. When Kincaid broke the news to Valerie, she didn't scream. She just stood there, staring at the horizon, her voice barely a whisper. "Do you know what it's like to hope so hard it hurts?" He didn't answer. The drive back to Stillwater felt longer than it should have. The radio was silent, the air thick with the kind of pain that doesn't fade, it sinks. By the time they reached town, that hope had turned into something heavier, grief wearing a disguise. The trip to Guthrie had drained everyone emotionally, mentally, completely. By the time Kincaid's team returned to Stillwater, reporters were already waiting outside the station. Their questions were sharp, impatient, hungry for movement in a case that refused to move. "Was it her?" one shouted. "Is it true the witness recanted?" Kincaid didn't answer. He pushed through the doors without a word, the sting of failure following him down the hall. Inside, his officers looked just as defeated. Another lead gone. Another night of hope turned to ashes. Valerie sat in the waiting area, clutching a photo of Taryn so tightly the edges were beginning to curl. When Kincaid told her the truth, she just nodded. "You keep saying every lead matters," she said, her tone calm but sharp. "But what happens when all of them are wrong?" Brooklyn arrived soon after, face pale, voice shaking. "People online are saying Trevor did it again," she said. "They won't stop." Kincaid rubbed his temples. "He's cleared," he muttered. But it didn't matter. In a town this small, the truth was whatever people decided to repeat. That night, as he closed his office blinds, Kincaid looked at Taryn's smiling face on the caseboard and realized something he couldn't say aloud. They weren't closer to finding her. They were further away. "Do you think ex-partners should always be the first suspects? Something was overlooked in this case. Can you guess what it was?" Outside, the posters on the lampposts were beginning to fade under the Oklahoma sun. What had once been a cry for help was becoming a ghost of its own. The media lights didn't flatter Valerie Whitlow. They burned. Each camera flash caught her face in ways she wished the world would forget. Sleepless eyes, trembling hands, a jaw locked not in fear but in fury. But she stood there anyway, in front of the Stillwater courthouse, gripping the podium like it was the only thing keeping her upright. "Someone knows where my daughter is," she said to the crowd, "and until that person speaks, I'll be right here." The reporters leaned in closer. The microphones picked up every crack in her voice, every pause heavy enough to fill the air between words. What had started as a mother's plea was becoming something else, a movement. Valerie refused to disappear like her daughter had. When police searches slowed, she called the press. When the public's interest faded, she lit candles on every anniversary, gathering strangers, students, and anyone who would listen. Some came out of sympathy. Others came because they couldn't stop thinking about that yellow cottage and the girl who never came home. Detective Kincaid watched one of those vigils from across the street, hands deep in his coat pockets. He couldn't face her, not when he still had no answers. But Valerie didn't need apologies. She needed witnesses. She was more than a file, Valerie said into the microphone, her voice steady now. She was my only child, my reason, and I will not let her name fade from your memory. The crowd fell silent. The wind caught the flames of their candles, but none went out. Valerie had just made her vow, and she would keep it, no matter how many years passed. Every Sunday at dusk, the same routine unfolded on Elm Street. A folding table, a few candles, a stack of flyers with Taryn's face, and Valerie Whitlow standing quietly in front of them. She didn't shout. She didn't plead. She just stood there, her presence doing what words no longer could. At first, people came out of sympathy. Neighbors brought flowers, students stopped by on their way home from class, even local store owners left their lights on a little longer. But as weeks turned into months, attendance began to thin. People moved on as people do. Yet every Sunday Valerie stayed. Her silence became louder than the town's indifference. Passing cars slowed. New students asked questions. The flyers were replaced each time they faded, the ink still smelling fresh while the hope behind them aged. Detective Kincaid came once, standing at a distance under the glow of a streetlight. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Valerie saw him, nodded once, and turned back to the small crowd. Whatever existed between them wasn't resentment anymore, it was shared exhaustion. Stillwater learned to live with its discomfort. The Sunshine Shack remained untouched, a frozen time capsule on a cheerful street that never smiled the same way again. One local newspaper wrote, "It's been a year, but the woman with the candles won't let us forget." Valerie clipped that article and taped it inside her kitchen cupboard, right next to her daughter's graduation photo. Each Sunday night ended the same, a final candle lit, a soft prayer whispered, and the echo of one mother's promise keeping an entire town from forgetting what was lost. As the years stretched forward, Valerie learned that hope could be both a companion and a curse. It was the reason she woke up every morning, and the weight that pressed on her chest at night. Her house had grown quieter. Friends stopped calling after the first few anniversaries, unsure what to say anymore. Her co-workers avoided bringing up family events, birthdays, graduations, all reminders of what she no longer had. But Valerie didn't resent them. She had simply learned that grief makes people uncomfortable. She still talked to Taryn out loud. Every morning she'd set 2 cups of coffee on the kitchen counter, one untouched, one slowly cooling as she read old letters and university pamphlets her daughter once filled out. "You'd have loved the city," she would say softly, tracing the handwriting with her thumb. When the wind carried laughter from the nearby campus, Valerie would pause, listening, hoping for a familiar sound in a sea of strangers. The town kept growing. The world moved on. Only her purpose remained still. Detective Kincaid retired that year. He left a short note on her porch that read, "Some cases don't end, but they don't die either." She kept it folded in her wallet, a small token of unfinished business. At the next vigil, only 6 people showed up. Valerie lit every candle herself, her movements methodical, deliberate. "She's not forgotten," she whispered, even as her voice trembled. For Valerie, hope wasn't belief in miracles anymore. It was defiance, the refusal to let time erase the truth. The 20th candlelight vigil drew fewer people than ever before, yet somehow it felt larger. The air was cold, the kind that bites at the skin, but Valerie's voice cut through it, steady, unwavering, raw with memory. She was 22, she began, looking over the small crowd. She had plans, friends, a future, and she should have made it home that night. A few people bowed their heads. Others stared at the flame in their hands, the light flickering across faces that had aged since the first vigil 2 decades ago. Reporters stood at a distance, their cameras rolling, capturing the scene that had become a ritual, a mother refusing to let her child vanish twice. Valerie's tone grew stronger with every word. They say time heals. It doesn't. It just teaches you how to carry the wound. Behind her, the wind rustled through the signs pinned to the memorial board, photos, ribbons, notes faded by rain and years. She reached out, touching the one in the center, Taryn's smiling face, and whispered, "I kept my promise, sweetheart. I never stopped." Detective Vega, who had just joined the department, stood among the crowd, listening quietly. Something in Valerie's words settled deep, a spark that would reignite the case one day. As the vigil ended, Valerie turned toward the camera lights one last time. "If you've ever lost someone and refused to stop believing, then you understand me," she said. "And if you haven't, I hope you never do." The candles burned low, but none went out. Would you have the strength to keep searching for 20 years? By the 5th year, the Whitlow case file had stopped being a priority and become a routine. Detective Lyle Kincaid kept it in the bottom drawer of his filing cabinet, a heavy folder, corners bent, pages stained from too many sleepless nights. Every 6 months, almost like clockwork, he'd pull it out. He'd reread the reports, rechecked the maps, skimmed the witness statements that no longer surprised him. He'd circle the same addresses, highlight the same names, and close the folder with the same quiet sigh. "Nothing new," he'd say aloud, even when no one asked. His desk had changed over the years, new photos of his grandchildren, new case files stacked higher each month, but that folder never moved. It was his ghost, sitting patiently, waiting for him to give it life again. Across town, Valerie's hair had turned gray, but her determination hadn't dulled. The vigils had become smaller, quieter now, just a handful of candles, and one mother standing beneath a lamppost. She no longer asked for cameras or crowds, she only asked for truth. When Kincaid passed by her one night after work, he slowed his car but didn't stop. She didn't wave. They didn't need to. Both of them understood that silence had become its own form of conversation. Back at the precinct, the fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead as Kincaid placed the folder back into the drawer. He hesitated before shutting it, his hand lingering on the handle. "For now," he whispered. The drawer clicked shut softly, but it sounded like an ending. By the 10th year, Stillwater had changed its skin. New buildings stood where the old ones once leaned. Fresh faces filled classrooms that used to echo with Taryn's laughter. The Crimson Ale House had closed and reopened under a new name, its walls freshly painted as if trying to erase what they once witnessed. When people spoke of the Whitlow case, it was in past tense now. "That poor girl," someone would say, shaking their head before moving on to weekend plans or the local football score. Memory had shrunk to small talk. Valerie walked through town each morning. Past the same streets her daughter once walked. Past windows filled with lives still moving forward. She'd stop at the grocery store, buy flowers, and place them at the base of the old oak tree near the sunshine shack. The petals never lasted long, but she kept replacing them, her quiet protest against forgetting. Detective Kincaid, now nearing retirement, would sometimes read old clippings out of habit. He'd wonder how many other case files ended the same way, not with justice, but with time winning. He visited Valerie once, unannounced. She was sitting on the porch, knitting in the soft light of afternoon. "You still check it?" she asked, not looking up. "Sometimes," he replied, "even when I know what I'll find." She gave a faint smile. "Then we're both stubborn." When he left, she watched his car disappear down the street and whispered, "Some of us don't get to stop." In Stillwater, the leaves changed, the seasons turned, and only one name stayed constant. Taryn Whitlow, a story once told in every home, now carried by just one heart. Detective Lyle Kincaid's last day at the precinct was unceremonious, a few handshakes, a boxed-up career, and a desk that suddenly looked too empty. The Whitlow file lay on top, bound by a single rubber band. For years he'd promised himself that he'd close it before retirement. Now, that hope sat in front of him, unresolved. He carried the folder to the archives room, walked past the rows of forgotten names, and stopped at the cold cases shelf. For a moment, he just stared at the empty space, waiting for her file. His fingers tightened around the folder, unwilling to let it go. "Sorry, kid," he muttered under his breath. "I tried." When he finally placed it on the shelf, the sound was almost imperceptible, a faint thud swallowed by the hum of the air conditioner. That was how decades of searching ended, quietly, without applause, without closure. Across town, Valerie was lighting a candle outside the Sunshine Shack. She did it every November, marking another year without answers. The flame flickered gently in the wind, small but steady, much like her resolve. She whispered the same words she had every year. "I'm still here, Taryn. I'm still waiting." The street was empty now, but her voice carried in the still air. As Kincaid drove home one last time, he passed the old oak tree where Valerie's flowers always rested. He didn't stop, but he slowed, nodding once, a silent salute to a mother who refused to surrender when he finally had to. Some stories don't die, they just sleep, waiting for someone brave enough to wake them again. How many stories like this fade into silence before justice catches up? The box labeled Whitlow tea had sat untouched for almost 5 years before someone finally pulled it off the shelf again. The dust lifted in a thin cloud, the kind that carries memories more than dirt. Inside were yellowing photos, handwritten notes, and evidence bags sealed with brittle tape. Detective Astrid Vega leaned over the box, scanning the first page of the case summary. Her expression didn't waver, but her eyes sharpened as she read. 20 years, she murmured. "Let's see what you've been hiding." Vega was new to Stillwater, sharp-tongued, calm under pressure, and known for turning forgotten cases into solved ones. Her colleagues called her obsessive. She called it discipline. Captain Hensley stood by the doorway, arms crossed. "That one's a dead end," he said. "Every detective who's touched it burned out or retired. Don't make it your hill to die on." Vega didn't look up. "The evidence remembers what people forget," she said. "I just have to make it talk again." She flipped through the old report statements typed on fading letterhead, photographs clipped to corners, fragments of a night that had once set a whole town on edge. Somewhere in those pages, she felt, was a truth no one had seen clearly enough to name. Later that evening, she placed the box on her desk and labeled it with a fresh tag, Active Review. Her pen pressed hard into the paper, an act of defiance against the decades of silence that came before her. As the precinct lights dimmed, Vega stayed behind, eyes fixed on the evidence photos. The case wasn't whispering yet, but it was stirring, and she was ready to listen. Detective Vega spread the contents of the Whitlow file across her desk, arranging them like puzzle pieces that had been waiting for decades to fit. Photos of Taryn, smiling under summer light, interview transcripts marked with faded pen strokes, maps dotted with circles that led nowhere, all pieces of a story that had grown cold from neglect. The deeper she read, the more she saw what time had done to it. Evidence misplaced. Statements incomplete. Leads abandoned because technology back then couldn't keep up with curiosity. It wasn't incompetence, it was limitation. Still, something about the case tugged at her. There was precision in Kincaid's notes, clear, careful handwriting that revealed a man who had tried, who had wanted to find her. But there was also exhaustion written between the lines. Vega could almost hear it, the sighs of a detective who'd run out of places to look. In the back of the file was a sealed envelope marked Evidence, Fiber Sample 2001. The handwriting was Kincaid's. Vega turned it over in her hand. "You held on to this," she whispered, "but you never got the answer." She sat back in her chair, the low hum of the office clock filling the room. So many cases ended this way, not with truth, but with time stealing the chance to find it. But not this one. She placed the envelope in a new evidence bag and wrote on the label, "To be retested." Then she paused, a small smile forming as she muttered to herself, "Let's see what 20 years of progress can uncover." For the first time, the Whitlow case didn't feel like history. It felt alive again. 2 weeks into her review, Vega's office had transformed into a command center of red folders and evidence photographs pinned across the wall. Every detail of Taryn's final hours was mapped, measured, questioned. She noticed something odd: a gap in the timeline between the last confirmed sighting at the Crimson Ale House and the time listed on the initial police call. 47 minutes unaccounted for. The reports mentioned it, but no one had ever explained it. That gap bothered her. 47 minutes, she murmured. That's not coincidence. That's action. Vega replayed the interviews on an old recorder, listening to the tone of every voice. Brooklyn's trembling account. Valerie's numb confusion. Trevor Scott's flat denial. Each one offered pieces, but one sentence from a bartender caught her attention. The janitor left right after she did. She paused the tape. The janitor. There was no name attached, just an unsigned line in the witness log. It had been noted, then ignored. Vega wrote it down in bold letters. Find him. Back in the evidence bag, that fiber sample weighed heavier now. A thread of possibility connecting 2 decades apart. Vega typed up a formal request for advanced forensic testing. MVAC extraction and DNA cross-reference, she wrote. Her superior raised an eyebrow. You really think that old evidence is going to talk? Vega didn't look up. It's been quiet long enough. That night, as the lab sealed the samples for testing, Vega stood at the window overlooking the empty parking lot. For the first time since reopening the file, she felt the faint thrill of progress. The whisper that maybe the story wasn't over. The lab lights buzzed softly overhead as Vega stood behind the glass, watching the technicians handle evidence older than some of them were. The cotton fiber, sealed since 2001, looked like nothing, a speck of lint trapped inside a plastic sleeve. But to Vega, it was a time capsule waiting to speak. Technology had changed everything. The MVAC system, capable of extracting microscopic DNA from porous surfaces, was now standard for cold case reanalysis. What had once been considered useless could now rewrite history. The process took hours. Vega stayed the entire time, pacing, her coffee growing cold beside her. When the lead technician finally stepped into the observation room, he held a printed sheet in his hand. We've got a partial match, he said. Not a full ID yet, but the system's flagging a genetic line. Her heart thudded once, hard. From where? Family match in the National Genealogy Database. Someone uploaded a DNA profile last year. We're tracing the connection now. Vega exhaled slowly, the weight of 20 years lifting just enough to let hope in. That's our first heartbeat, she said. She returned to her desk and opened the case photo of Taryn, the same one Kincaid had once pinned above his. Looks like you're finally getting your voice back, she whispered. Her computer chimed. The database had found something. A surname, faint but distinct. Vega's eyes froze on the screen. She didn't smile. She didn't speak. She just whispered, "It begins." The cold case wasn't cold anymore, it was waking up. Can new technology really solve what 20 years of searching couldn't? The fiber sample moved like contraband through the sterile hallways of the forensic lab from hand to hand, signature to signature, until it reached the workstation marked Cold Case Re-Extraction, 2001. Detective Vega stood behind the viewing glass, her reflection faintly overlaying the white lab coats beyond it. She'd waited weeks for this moment, and now, the hum of the machine sounded like a pulse returning to life. Each step of the process felt sacred, the MVAC humming softly as it drew microscopic particles from the preserved cotton strand, the centrifuge spinning the extracted residue into the narrow glass vial, the technician sealing it under UV light. 20 years ago, this fragment was dismissed as contamination. Today, it could be the key. Sample confirmed. The technician called out. DNA material viable. Vega exhaled sharply, not in relief but in restraint. It wasn't the result yet, but it was proof that the evidence still remembered. She turned toward the board in her office, her eyes tracing the photos, Taryn smiling in the bar, the map of Elm Street, the old suspect list. At the center, a question she had written in black ink. Who was near her that night? The lab called again 2 days later. Detective Vega? You might want to sit down for this. She didn't. Tell me. We have a genealogical hit partial family link. We're running the cross-reference now. Vega looked up at Taryn's picture one last time and whispered, "You've waited long enough." The chain of evidence had spoken, and its voice was leading her somewhere new. Her eyes fixed on the name, reading it over and over, the letters growing heavier with each glance. Thorne. The surname didn't appear anywhere in the original files. Not among Taryn's friends, not in the town registry, not in Kincaid's notes. Which meant one thing: whoever this was, they had slipped through untouched. By sunrise, Vega was at her desk, hair tied back, coffee untouched. The lab report was waiting, the data clean and final. The DNA extracted from the fiber, recovered from the hem of Taryn's sleeve, carried a close familial link to a man named Dalton Thorne, residing less than 30 miles away. She stared at his record. No criminal history, no violent offenses, a maintenance worker, married, 2 children. Lived quietly in a small neighborhood outside of Stillwater. Her pulse quickened. "You were there," she whispered, "and no one ever looked at you." Scrolling deeper through the employment logs, Vega froze. Thorne had worked part-time for the alehouse maintenance crew in 2000, and the same summer Taryn disappeared. Every muscle in her body tensed. The missing puzzle piece had been sitting in plain sight for 20 years. She called the lab. "Confirm the DNA to Thorne himself," she said firmly, "and put him under silent observation until I say otherwise." The storm had begun quietly, precisely, and with purpose. Dalton Thorne looked like every other man in the neighborhood, early 50s, graying hair, routine smile, the kind of face that fit anywhere and drew attention nowhere. He worked at the local elementary school as a janitor, clocking in early, clocking out quietly. Neighbors described him as polite, reserved, helpful with small chores, the perfect disguise for someone who had learned to blend in. Detective Vega sat in an unmarked car across the street, notebook open, recording every detail. His routes were predictable: school, grocery store, home. He never varied his schedule, never lingered outside familiar spaces. But there was something unsettling about how still he was, like a man who had practiced being harmless. At first, Vega looked for outward signs of guilt, nervous habits, unease, avoidance. None appeared. Instead, she began noticing what wasn't there. No photos in his front window, no mail piling up, no visitors, just silence. When she requested his employment records, the pattern deepened. He'd moved towns twice since 2001, each time after a maintenance job ended abruptly. No reasons listed, no complaints filed, just clean departures, like erasing footprints before anyone noticed they existed. She scribbled in her notes, "Not invisible. Careful." Late that night, Vega parked near his house again. Through the curtains, she could see him reading under a dim lamp. Ordinary scene. Ordinary man, yet everything in her gut screamed otherwise. She pressed record on her phone. Subject: Dalton Thorne, she whispered. Living proof that evil doesn't always hide, sometimes it waits. Outside, the Oklahoma wind howled softly against her windshield. Inside, Vega's pulse drummed in her ears. The hunt had just begun. The call came mid-afternoon, while Vega was sorting through her notes for the 3rd time that day. The voice on the other end was steady, professional, but she caught the flicker of triumph beneath it. "Detective Vega, we've completed the comparison," the technician said. "Full DNA alignment confirmed, match probability exceeds 99.9%. The fiber belongs to Dalton Thorne." For a moment, Vega didn't move. The words hung in the air like static, vibrating through her bones. "You're certain?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "Completely," the voice replied. "Same genetic markers, same extraction pattern. It's him." She leaned back in her chair, eyes closing briefly. 20 years of silence, broken by one microscopic strand. Her computer monitor still displayed Thorne's photo, plain expression, faint smile, utterly ordinary. Vega stared at it, feeling the edges of disbelief blur into anger. He lived freely. He walked these streets. He watched everyone forget. She replayed Kincaid's old recording from the archives, his voice gravelly with fatigue. "It's like she walked off the face of the earth." Vega whispered back, "No, she didn't. He buried her there." She grabbed her phone and dialed the precinct. "We've got him," she said. "Confirm the warrant prep, but no contact yet. I want eyes on him 24/7 until I say otherwise." Her reflection in the darkened window showed a faint smile, not of joy but of resolve. The waiting was over. The truth had a name now, and it lived down the road. What if the answer to a 20-year mystery was hiding in plain sight? Detective Vega drove through Stillwater just before dawn, the streets empty except for the occasional flicker of a traffic light changing for no one. Dalton Thorne's address was scrawled across the passenger seat, the paper creased from being folded and unfolded too many times. She'd memorized it already, every digit, every detail. Outside his modest house, the lights were still off. The world slept, unaware that a 20-year secret was sitting inside, sipping coffee and reading a newspaper like any other morning. Vega's hand hovered near the ignition, torn between action and patience. Every instinct screamed to end it now. But the case deserved precision, not impulse. She opened her notepad, scribbling one final line under Thorne's name: "Wait until he feels safe, then take him down." Behind her, the sky began to pale, brushing the town in faint light. Vega leaned back, eyes fixed on the quiet home across the street. The weight of every missing girl, every grieving mother, every unsolved file pressed on her shoulders, but Taryn's face stayed at the front. "You've waited long enough," she whispered. Her phone buzzed surveillance confirming his morning routine. Nothing out of place, nothing suspicious, yet everything about him was. The camera zoomed in on Thorne stepping outside, locking his door with the calmness of a man who believed his past was buried forever. Guess what Vega does next? Would you confront him? Or wait? She tightened her grip on the steering wheel, pulse steady, eyes hard. She vanished because she trusted a familiar place. You're trusting the unknown every time you scroll past stories like this. Subscribe now, because safety starts with awareness. Dalton Thorne had spent 20 years perfecting the art of normal. Every habit, every glance, every word was rehearsed until it disappeared into routine. He was the man who always showed up early, always offered a helping hand, always smiled just enough to seem safe. To the parents at Stillwater Elementary, he was Mr. Thorne, dependable, quiet, polite. He fixed broken lockers, swept the halls, and whistled low tunes during late shifts. The children liked him, the teachers trusted him. The town had no reason to look closer. But Vega looked closer. From her surveillance van parked down the block, she watched him through a camera feed that never blinked. Day after day, Thorne's life unfolded like clockwork. School, grocery run, solitary dinners. No alcohol, no visitors, no sudden moves. Her partner, Agent Rowe, leaned back in the seat beside her. "He's clean," he said, yawning. "Maybe too clean." Vega didn't answer. Her eyes stayed fixed on the monitor. "People don't erase guilt," she said softly. "They bury it under normal." At night, she'd replay the footage, studying the small details, the way his hands lingered over a child's drawing before he wiped the board clean, the subtle flinch when a police cruiser drove by. Every second fed her conviction. He wasn't harmless. He was hiding in plain sight. When the surveillance drone captured him burning papers in a backyard barrel after midnight, Vega leaned forward, pulse rising. "Got you," she whispered. She didn't know what he was destroying yet, but she knew why. The quiet mask had just cracked. Detective Vega's desk was covered in paper trails, old pay stubs, outdated ID photos, scattered records pulled from state databases. Each document whispered a little more about Dalton Thorne's life, but none of them felt complete. The man had mastered the art of disappearing without ever leaving. His work history showed a curious pattern. Between 2001 and 2005, Thorne held 3 different maintenance jobs across Oklahoma, each ending abruptly after less than a year. No recorded disputes, no disciplinary notes, just quiet resignations and immediate moves to nearby towns. A clean record, perfectly timed transitions. Vega frowned, circling each date on the board. "He never stays long enough for people to ask questions," she said. Agent Rowe glanced over her shoulder. "Smart enough to stay invisible." "Too smart," Vega replied. She called the Human Resources office from one of his former jobs in Tulsa. The woman on the other end hesitated when Vega mentioned his name. Dalton Thorne? Yeah, I remember him. Kind man, polite. But one day he just didn't show up. Cleared his locker the night before. Did he leave a forwarding address? Vega asked. A pause. No. Just gone. When Vega hung up, she stared at the string of cities on her board, connected by thin red thread. Stillwater, Tulsa, Enid, each one marked by unsolved missing person reports that, until now, had never been linked. Her pulse quickened as she traced her finger along the thread. He didn't vanish, she muttered. He relocated. For 20 years, Dalton Thorne hadn't just been living free, he'd been rehearsing a lie so ordinary it became invisible. And Vega was about to expose it. The camera feed flickered softly in the surveillance van as Vega and her team watched Thorne's every movement. He was still predictable: coffee at dawn, drive to work, dinner alone, but something in his rhythm had started to fracture. The first sign came when he looked over his shoulder walking to his car. Once, twice, then again the next day. He lingered by his mailbox longer than usual, scanning the street as if expecting someone. He knows, Rowe muttered, eyes on the monitor. Vega didn't blink. No, she said. He feels it. There's a difference. She'd seen it before, that flicker of awareness when predators realized the silence around them was no longer theirs. They didn't panic right away. They tested the air first, looked for gaps, convinced themselves it was nothing. But paranoia never stayed quiet for long. Vega opened her field notes. Subject exhibiting surveillance awareness. Maintain distance. Observe deviation in schedule. That deviation came sooner than expected. Instead of heading straight home after work, Thorne drove to the outskirts of town and parked near a wooded trail. He sat there for nearly an hour, no calls, no visitors, just waiting. Then, without warning, he drove off, taking a different route back. He's checking for tails, Vega said quietly. He's been through this before. Rowe raised an eyebrow. You think he's done it more than once? Vega's jaw tightened. I think we've only scratched the surface. As the night deepened, Thorne's house lights flickered on. He closed his blinds. For the first time since the surveillance began, he didn't come out again. The watching game was ending soon. It would be the catching one. The map on Vega's board no longer looked like a string of coincidences, it looked like a pattern. Stillwater, Tulsa, Enid, Guthrie. Each town separated by years, but each marked by one thing. A young woman reported missing during or shortly after Thorne's time there. She opened the old case archives, cross-referencing dates with employment records. In Tulsa, 2003, a college student named Renee Porter vanished, walking home from her part-time job. In Enid, 2004, a waitress disappeared after her shift. No forced entry, no trace. In Guthrie, 2005, a traveler was last seen at a service station off Highway 33. The same stretch of road where Taryn's false sighting had once been reported. Vega's stomach turned. He'd moved after each one. Quietly. Predictably. Unnoticed. She called Agent Rowe into the room. Every city he's touched has a missing girl, she said, voice tight. We weren't looking for one predator. We were looking for a pattern of movement. Rowe stared at the board. You think he kept trophies? Vega exhaled slowly. No. He kept routines. She looked down at Thorne's photo, the same soft smile, the same neatly pressed shirt from his work ID, the portrait of calm. Monsters don't always hide in basements, she said quietly. Sometimes they sweep hallways and unlock doors. That night, she drove past Stillwater Elementary, where Thorne still worked. The playground sat empty, swings creaking in the wind. Vega parked across the street, headlights off, watching the faint glow from the janitor's window. Her fingers hovered over the radio. Tomorrow, she whispered. Tomorrow we end this. The past was no longer distant, it was alive, and breathing just down the road. The plan was simple: no warning, no mistakes, no second chances. Vega briefed the team inside the surveillance van, her voice low but steady. He leaves for work at 6:45 sharp. We move before he hits the end of the block. We take him alive. Every officer in the room felt the weight of her words. 20 years of waiting balanced on a morning routine. Outside, the dawn crept slowly over Stillwater, painting the sky in muted gray. Vega sat in the driver's seat, eyes fixed on Thorne's front door. Her pulse matched the ticking of the clock on the dashboard. At 6:43, the door opened. Thorne stepped out, dressed neatly in his work uniform, coffee mug in hand, a man walking straight into his reckoning without knowing it. "Now," Vega whispered. The convoy rolled forward, silent and smooth. 2 vehicles blocked the road ahead. Another sealed the rear exit. Thorne froze mid-step as officers emerged, guns drawn but voices controlled. "Dalton Thorne, you're under arrest," Vega called, stepping out from the car. Her tone was cold steel. He blinked, confusion sliding into resignation. His coffee mug fell to the pavement, shattering at his feet. For a moment, the only sound was the drip of coffee pooling near his shoes. As the cuffs locked around his wrists, Vega stood close enough to see the flicker of realization in his eyes, not fear, but recognition. He knew exactly why they'd come. Vega's voice was calm, final. "We've got him." The radio crackled confirmation, and with it, 2 decades of silence finally broke. Do you believe evil can truly hide behind an ordinary face? The interrogation room was small, a steel table, 2 chairs, 1 buzzing light. It smelled of dust and fear. Dalton Thorne sat motionless, hands cuffed in front of him, his gaze fixed on the scuffed tabletop. His calmness was almost unnatural, as if he'd practiced this moment for years. Detective Vega entered without a word, file in hand. She didn't look at him right away. She placed the folder on the table, opened it slowly, and let the photograph spill out Taryn's face, the crime scene shots, the fiber report. Each image landed like a hammer. "You know who she is," Vega said quietly. Thorne's eyes flickered once. "I've seen the news," he replied. His tone was dry, stripped of emotion. Vega leaned forward. "You were there, Dalton. You worked maintenance at the Crimson Ale House. You saw her that night." He didn't answer. She placed the DNA report in front of him, sliding it across the table. "That fiber you left on her jacket, it remembers you." His jaw tightened. The first crack. "You spent 20 years cleaning hallways, pretending to live a normal life," Vega continued. "But this," she tapped the folder, "was never going away." Thorne exhaled slowly, eyes still fixed on the table. "People forget," he muttered. "Not all people," Vega said. The silence between them stretched thin, a rope ready to snap. Through the observation glass, Agent Rowe whispered to the officers, "She's not rushing it. She's letting him feel the weight." And in that quiet, Thorne shifted in his chair for the first time, small but enough. The unraveling had begun. Vega didn't raise her voice. She didn't threaten or accuse. She simply began asking questions, ordinary, almost polite. "What time did you finish work that night? Who locked up the back door? Do you remember seeing her leave?" Thorne's answers were slow and measured, his voice steady. "I cleaned the restroom. Left around midnight. Didn't see anyone." But Vega noticed something, a pause before didn't. The smallest hesitation. "You're sure about that?" she pressed gently. He shrugged. "Pretty sure." Vega leaned back, folding her arms. "You ever wonder why she walked out alone? 6 blocks from home? And she never made it?" Thorne's fingers twitched against the metal cuffs. His calm exterior was slipping, not because of her tone, but because she refused to fill the silence for him. The quiet made him listen to his own lies. "You know what I think?" Vega said finally. "I think you watched her leave. Maybe you offered her a ride. Maybe you said something kind. You're good at that, aren't you?" Sounding harmless. Thorne's breathing changed, shallow now, uneven. His gaze darted briefly to the photos. "You don't know what happened," he muttered. Vega nodded slowly. "Then tell me." He looked up for the first time, eyes clouded, not with guilt, but with something emptier. "She shouldn't have trusted me," he said softly. Vega froze. That sentence, so casual, so revealing, cut through the room like a blade. "Through the glass," Rowe whispered. "He's slipping." Vega's voice dropped to a whisper. "Why, Dalton?" Thorne didn't answer. but his silence said more than words ever could. The room felt smaller now, the air heavy, the silence oppressive. Thorne's eyes darted between the photos, the file, and Vega's calm face. He wasn't in control anymore. Vega placed a small evidence bag on the table, the fiber sample, still labeled 2001. "You know what this is," she said. "It sat in a drawer for 20 years. It's the thread that never forgot you." Thorne's jaw tensed. "I already told you." She interrupted quietly. "You told me nothing." Her voice didn't rise. It simply cut through the stillness like truth, carving through denial. She slid another photo forward, Taryn's last known image leaving the Crimson Ale House. This was the moment she trusted the world. 6 blocks from safety. Thorne's breathing quickened. His fingers flexed. "You think you know everything," he muttered. Vega leaned forward. "No, but the evidence does. The fibers, the prints, the transfer. You were there. You touched her sleeve." The words landed hard. For the first time, his eyes glistened, not with remorse, but with something deeper, colder. He whispered, "It wasn't supposed to happen." Vega's stomach tightened. "Then what was supposed to happen, Dalton?" He swallowed, his voice cracking under the weight of memory. "She was scared. I tried to calm her. She ran, His throat closed. It took less than 2 minutes. Vega went still, the clock ticking loudly between them. 2 minutes. 20 years of searching for 2 minutes of horror. Her pen dropped to the table. "Say it," she whispered. He lowered his head. "I killed her." No outburst, no dramatics, just 4 words that shattered the room. Thorne sat in silence for a long time after the words left his mouth. The air conditioner buzzed faintly, the sound too normal for what was happening. Vega said nothing, she just waited. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady. "Tell me how." Thorne rubbed his wrists against the cuffs, his voice low, almost mechanical. "She was leaving the bar. I was fixing a light outside the alley. She said hello. She was kind." He stopped for a moment, staring past the table. "I offered to walk her partway home. She laughed, said she was fine." Vega watched him closely, her face unreadable. He swallowed hard. She dropped her keys near the fence. When she bent to pick them up, I grabbed her. I didn't plan it. I just did it. Like something inside me moved before I could think. Vega's hand clenched under the table. "And after?" He blinked slowly. She stopped struggling. I panicked. I put her in my truck. Drove out by the river. It was over in less than 2 minutes. 2 minutes. 20 years. He exhaled a long, shaking breath. I buried her near the old quarry. Went back the next day. Covered the spot with rocks. Vega's jaw tightened. The sound of his words, so calm, so factual, burned through her chest. He looked up for the first time. "I've thought about her every day." Vega's voice trembled slightly. "No, you thought about getting away with it." The silence that followed was unbearable. Even the officers behind the glass looked away. He said it took less than 2 minutes. What would you call that, evil or impulse? When Vega finally stood, her legs felt unsteady, not from exhaustion, but from the gravity of what she'd heard. Thorne sat motionless, hands still cuffed, his gaze empty. The weight of his words lingered in the air like smoke that refused to clear. She gathered the photos from the table, her fingers trembling just slightly. Each image, Taryn smiling. Taryn laughing, felt like a life she'd known. A life Thorne had stolen in less than 2 minutes. Behind the one-way glass, Agent Rowe's voice was quiet. 20 years for 2 minutes? You think that's justice?" Vega didn't answer. She just stared at Thorne, studying the man who had looked ordinary in every way. "Justice isn't supposed to feel this hollow," she said softly. The officers led him away, chains clinking, footsteps echoing down the corridor. When the door shut, Vega sat back down, alone in the empty room. She opened her notebook and wrote 3 words: "Found, but broken." For years, people in Stillwater had prayed for this moment, for truth, for closure. But as Vega looked at Taryn's photo one last time, she realized closure wasn't the same as peace. Sometimes the truth doesn't heal, it only confirms what people feared all along, that evil can live next door, smile in passing, and still go home to sleep soundly. Vega whispered under her breath, "You're gone, but we found you." Then she closed the file. The case was solved, the pain was not. If justice takes 20 years to arrive, is it still justice? The convoy rolled slowly toward the old quarry, headlights cutting through the mist that hung over the water's edge. 20 years ago, this place was just another forgotten stretch of Stillwater. Now, it was about to become sacred ground. Detective Vega stepped out first, boots sinking into the damp soil. The early morning air carried the sound of the river nearby, soft but relentless. A forensic team followed, careful, deliberate, silent. The coordinates Thorne gave had been precise. He hadn't hesitated when he revealed them. Near the old quarry by the East Ridge, he'd said, as if confessing directions instead of sins. When the first spade struck something solid beneath the earth, the sound rippled through the silence. The team leader signaled. Everyone froze. Minutes later, Vega saw it: fragments of fabric, bones, remnants of a life stolen but not erased. She took a step back, her throat tightening. It wasn't just evidence anymore. It was a person, a daughter, a name whispered through every sleepless night for 2 decades. A gentle voice broke the silence. "We found her." Vega closed her eyes. The words she'd chased for years finally carried weight, both relief and sorrow wrapped into one. As the remains were carefully lifted from the earth, the sun began to rise, painting the horizon in muted orange. It wasn't mercy. It was memory. For Stillwater, this was not the end, it was the long-awaited reckoning. And for Valerie Whitlow, it was the moment she both prayed for and dreaded more than anything. The news reached Valerie before sunrise. They'd found her daughter. When she arrived at the quarry, Vega was waiting not as a detective this time, but as a witness to a mother's private heartbreak. Valerie stepped out of the car slowly, her hands trembling, her face pale with disbelief. The forensic team lowered their heads in quiet respect. The site was still, the morning light soft against the earth that had kept its secret for 20 years. Vega approached gently. "We've confirmed it's her," she said quietly. Valerie's eyes filled instantly. Her voice broke before she could speak. "I knew she was close. I always knew." She moved closer, just beyond the taped perimeter, where the recovered remains rested beneath a white covering. She didn't cry out. She didn't collapse. She simply stood there, shoulders trembling, tears streaming freely, as if she was afraid any sound might disturb the peace that had finally returned to her daughter. "I told you I'd find you," she whispered, her words carried by the wind. "I never stopped looking." Vega turned away for a moment, fighting to keep her composure. Around them, officers who'd worked the case years ago stood silently, some with tears they didn't bother to hide. Valerie knelt, pressing her hand gently against her chest. "You can rest now," she murmured. "They found you, baby." It wasn't closure. It was surrender, the acceptance that love endures even when justice arrives too late. Vega stepped forward and placed her hand on Valerie's shoulder. No words, no explanation. Just shared silence, the kind that speaks louder than any promise ever could. News travels fast in small towns, especially when it carries both tragedy and closure. By noon, candles lined the front steps of Stillwater's courthouse. Strangers who hadn't spoken Taryn's name in years were suddenly saying it again softly, with guilt in their voices. Shops closed early that day. The local diner turned off its neon sign for the first time in decades. At the high school, teachers gathered students in the gym for a moment of silence. Some of them hadn't even been born when she disappeared, but the grief still found them. A radio host spoke through trembling words. 20 years ago, we lost one of our own. Today, we remember her, and we ask ourselves, how did we not see? Detective Vega stood outside the precinct window, watching the town shift under the weight of that question. Stillwater wasn't just grieving Taryn, it was grieving its innocence. For Valerie, the community's sudden compassion felt bittersweet. People dropped flowers at her gate, letters in her mailbox, messages of love and regret. She appreciated them all, but when the cameras left and the voices faded, the silence returned, and with it the truth. only she had carried that pain for 20 years. That night, the church bells rang one toll for each year Taryn had been gone. The sound echoed through every street, every home, every heart. Inside her living room, Valerie lit a candle beside her daughter's photo. Stillwater had finally remembered, but memory wasn't enough to erase the years of not knowing. The town had closure. Valerie had reality. Days later, a quiet service was held in the Stillwater chapel. No cameras, no press, just family, close friends, and a few detectives who had refused to give up. The air was thick with the weight of both loss and gratitude. Valerie sat in the front row, her hands clasped around a small pendant that once belonged to Taryn. The pastor spoke gently, his words drifting through the room like a soft current. "Some prayers take longer to reach heaven," he said, "but they are never forgotten." Vega stood at the back, her badge tucked away, not as a detective now but as a witness to grace. For 20 years, this case had defined her predecessor, broken hearts and reshaped lives. Now, it was finally at rest. When the service ended, Valerie approached her slowly. "You kept your promise," she said, her voice faint but steady. Vega shook her head. "You did. You never stopped believing." They embraced two women bound by a truth that had cost them both something irreplaceable. Outside, the town gathered around the memorial near the courthouse. The wind carried the scent of candles and rain as the plaque was unveiled. In memory of Taryn Whitlow, loved, missed, and finally found. Valerie stepped forward, tracing her fingers across the engraved letters. A tear slipped down her cheek, but this one was different. It wasn't from despair, it was release. As the sun dipped low, Vega looked at the crowd and thought quietly to herself, "Justice doesn't erase pain, it just stops the suffering from spreading." If you were Valerie, would this bring peace or reopen the pain? Stillwater didn't return to normal after Dalton Thorne's arrest. It learned to live with remembrance. The small town that once whispered in uncertainty now carried its silence differently, not as fear but as reverence. The streets where Taryn once walked were quieter now, not because people were scared, but because they were aware. The Crimson Ale House closed its doors permanently, leaving a hand-painted sign in the window. In memory of Taryn Whitlow, gone, but never forgotten. At night, the lights near the quarry flickered in the distance, not hauntingly, but as a reminder that some places hold both sorrow and truth. Detective Vega still visited from time to time. She'd stand near the memorial plaque, her hands in her coat pockets, watching the townsfolk leave flowers. Each time she came, she noticed something new, a folded letter, a ribbon, a photograph of another missing person from another town. The case had sparked more than grief. It had inspired others to reopen their own cold files, to keep searching. Valerie's house remained the same, except for one thing: the porch light now stayed on every night. For her, she once said, and for anyone still waiting for someone to come home. The town had found peace in remembering, not forgetting. Stillwater had become more than a location, it had become a symbol of what truth costs, and why silence should never win. The vigil took place on a cool autumn evening, 21 years to the day since Taryn disappeared. The courthouse lawn was lined with candles, each flame trembling in the wind like fragile memories refusing to fade. Valerie stood at the center, holding a small lantern. Her hair had turned silver with time, but her eyes still carried the same quiet strength that had kept the search alive. Around her were faces some she knew, many she didn't, all drawn by the same need to stand where justice had finally spoken. When the crowd fell silent, Valerie stepped forward and spoke. Her voice was soft but steady, carrying across the cold air. "There were nights I thought I'd never see this day," she said. "Nights when hope was just a word I whispered to keep breathing. But justice came. It came late, but it came." People nodded through tears. Some reached for the hands beside them. Vega watched from the edge of the crowd, her badge tucked away, her heart heavy but proud. This was what it had all been for, not the headlines, not the closure, but the proof that even 20 years later, the truth could still rise from silence. Valerie raised her lantern high. "For every mother still waiting," she said, "let this light remind you waiting isn't the same as giving up." The crowd joined her, lifting their candles one by one. The glow spread across the lawn until the entire square shimmered with gold. Stillwater was no longer defined by what it lost, but by what it refused to forget. Time teaches differently when pain is the teacher. In Stillwater, the years hadn't erased the past, they'd reshaped it, turning every unanswered question into a reason to keep asking. Detective Vega, now back in her office, often stared at the framed case file labeled Whitlow Closed. It wasn't pride she felt. It was perspective. The evidence, the reports, the sleepless nights, they weren't just about catching one man. They were reminders of how truth outlives those who try to bury it. She once told a trainee, "Time doesn't hide what happened. It just waits until someone's brave enough to look again." Across town, Valerie kept her own version of that truth. Every year on Taryn's birthday, she'd visit the memorial and replace the flowers herself, never delegating the task, never missing a date. When asked why, she simply said, "Because remembering is how I keep her here." The story had reached beyond Oklahoma. Now other towns reopened their own cold cases, inspired by the persistence that had carried Stillwater for 2 decades. News anchors called it the Whitlow effect, a movement proving that justice delayed isn't always justice denied. But for those who lived through it, the real lesson wasn't in the arrest or the headlines. It was in the patience, the pain, and the refusal to forget. Time had moved on, but truth had stayed. And in that balance, Stillwater found its peace. Every story leaves something behind, a lesson, a question, a whisper that lingers in the air long after the last word is spoken. For Stillwater, that echo was Taryn Whitlow. People began calling her the girl who didn't fade. Her name appeared on awareness campaigns, college safety programs, even community fundraisers for missing persons. Her story became a symbol not of tragedy, but of vigilance. Detective Vega was invited to speak at one such event months later. Standing before a small crowd, she began not with facts, but with truth. "We solved the case," she said, "but that's not what matters most. What matters is how many lives we save by remembering her." The audience listened in silence, the kind that carries weight, not emptiness. Valerie sat in the front row, holding the same pendant she'd worn at the vigil. When Vega finished, she walked up and embraced her. No words, just gratitude shared between 2 women who had carried the same echo in different ways. Outside, as night fell, the memorial lights shimmered softly. The town had changed doors locked earlier. People walked home together, and the community checked in on one another. It wasn't fear that guided them now, it was awareness. Stillwater no longer whispered about the past. It spoke its lessons out loud. And somewhere in that truth, between the tears and the candles, Taryn's voice still lived, not as sorrow, but as warning and as hope. The echo of Stillwater was no longer silence. It was remembrance made eternal. The camera fades to the Stillwater Memorial at dusk, candles flickering, names engraved in bronze, the sound of wind weaving through quiet streets. Vega's voice overlays the scene, soft but resolute. Some say justice loses its meaning when it arrives too late, but justice isn't about timing, it's about truth finding its way home, no matter how long it takes. Images fade between the courthouse steps, the quarry, and Valerie's porch light glowing through the night. That light, steady, unwavering, has become the town's unofficial symbol of hope. Valerie's words from the vigil echo one last time. Justice came late, but it came. A pause. Then Vega's narration continues. Taryn's story reminds us that silence protects no one, that trust should never replace caution, and that remembering, truly remembering, is how we keep others safe. The screen darkens for a moment before the narrator speaks directly to the viewer, voice tightening with sincerity. Stories like this remind us that time doesn't erase truth. Subscribe and stay with us, because every mystery deserves its ending. The final shot lingers on the Stillwater Memorial, lights glowing faintly as the narration deepens into one last, fear-instigated warning. Most people think it'll never happen near them until it does. Subscribe now so you're never caught off guard, and if you still won't, head to the comments. Tell us why you'd rather stay in the dark. The music fades, the light remains. Stillwater sleeps, but the story never will.